Thank you, Mina, for joining us today at College Futures, and thank you to everyone who follows and engages with College Futures on social media. Let's get started. Hi, Mina.
Hi.
It's good to always be in conversation with you over the years. So I wanted to kick off our conversation and talk about the value of post-secondary education. It's really over the last several years, some may even say the last 10, 15 years, where the question of the value of post-secondary education is front and center. What's the value to an individual, to a learner, to someone who's coming back from many years of working? What's the value to a state? How does education add up to provide the kind of economic well-being, really viable financial future, for a state? You've been in those conversations for a very long time and have really driven a set of knowledge around credentials of value specifically. Say more about that.
I think it was 2015 when we published the first study it was one of the first studies that found that community college credentials gave different opportunities to learners in terms of what wages the learners would earn as a result. Community colleges, as your listeners know, they offer certificates, associate degrees, they are incredible transfer pathways. And we found that depending on the level of a credential, whether it was an associate degree or a certificate, and the specific program that students were enrolled in, students got vastly different outcomes. And that work was very controversial at the time. At the time, people were asking questions of, are generally associate degrees a good idea? Are generally certificates are a good idea? And it is really exciting to see that is not controversial anymore. A lot of researchers now have worked on the same kind of analysis and have really found the same thing, that specific programs of study lead to different credentials with different values for individuals.
You remind me, as I hear you, about the importance of context and time. 2015, the height of college completion movement, let's ensure attainment, very much a focus on how do we ensure that the opportunity for a BA degree is possible. And that question is still important. But what you remind me is that moving into more of a credential is also recognizing where students start. And they start at different points, they have different decisions to make. And so let's look, does that credential allow a student, a learner, to meet the goal that they have at that time? Which takes me to, why you're here at Equity Solutions just released a dual value framework, which in some ways feels like a culmination of some of that work, though, to your point, it's ongoing. So share more about why the framework, why a dual value framework, and what do you think it contributes to the field and this conversation around the credentials of value?
I think we do need to look at value to individuals and communities together, because when we don't, then we will under-resource credentials that really have value both to individuals and to communities. And at the same time, something that might happen is we have to then choose also between value to individuals or communities. So a really good example of that is, credentials in early childhood education, really important CNA jobs that are really valuable to hospitals and to communities, but result in low wages. And when we don't look at the picture together, at the state level, we might not make the investments that really maximize value to individuals and value to communities. So we have very detailed definitions of value to individuals and value to communities. And maybe I'll just say, for value to communities, we really are looking at credentials in fields like healthcare, education, protective services, infrastructure that support essential community functions.
But I want to sort of pull back and go back to the research that has really kind of shaped and informed your thinking and thinking about this, and in particular stackable credentials, and the work that you've done around the stackability of credentials, particularly in health, given the demand and given the diversity of occupations within that sector. And I think for many of us, we are very excited about the possibility that, because they're often described as a solution for creating pathways to better jobs, not getting locked into low-wage jobs immediately, but there's a lot required of that first of all, that, credentials are actually recognized, that they're valued in the field. But you've done a lot of research on that and have actually, I think, both informed but also complicated some of the assumptions and understanding we have around stackability. Would love to hear more about that and what you've learned by talking to actual learners who are in programs for a credential.
There's a lot of discussion of stackability, right? But when we actually look at research literature, the instance of stackability is very low. There are very few actual students that stack credentials. I think the estimates are around 3 to 5% nationally. The question is why? I think one thing we know is that creating stackable pipelines and actually supporting students to take advantage of them is very resource intensive. And something that we've learned in conversation with students is that, we actually interviewed 80 plus credential earners, mostly students of color, credential earners of color. These are certificate earners in manufacturing. And, they entered the certificate programs, ended up getting jobs that, operator level jobs at manufacturing plants, which are really well suited for high school graduates. In fact, when we interviewed employers would say, we hire the certificate earners and we hire high school graduates. And it's great that community colleges are providing the certificate. But when we talked with the credential earners, they wanted a direct path to living wage jobs. And, the colleges that really cared about this issue, that partnered with us, wanted us to understand why students were not coming back to get a higher level credential that would actually result in living wage job, why students were not using these as stackable pathways. What we heard from students was this disillusionment in the value of college. A lot of these students, they were the first one in their family to attend college, and they were taking a risk already with the certificate. And when it did not pan out, we heard, I had a quote from one student saying, it did not work out for me the first time. Why would I even invest even more time and money and take a bigger risk? What if it doesn't work out for me again? The second reason we heard from these certificate earners was that, in entry-level jobs, it is really hard to get your employer to commit to sending you back for training. In fact, we heard from employers saying, these are high turnover positions. We're not investing in training for these positions, right? All to say that for some credentials, we should not be thinking about stackability. It's just not going to work. But then when we think about community value credentials, those that may result in low wages but have extremely high community value, that is where we really should be zeroing in on efforts to create stackable pipelines. And without state intervention, it's really hard to really scale these stackable pathways. So that is, I think, another contribution of the framework is really helping states zero in on when do you use stackability as a strategy, and when do you really have to acknowledge that there are credentials that maybe are better as apprenticeship opportunities, or they have outdated competencies, and that is why they're not leading to living wage jobs.
So I'm really glad that we've landed back to this question of the state, because you're starting to talk about what institutions are doing almost in spite of and doing on their own. And your framework really begs this question about the role of the state. And I think what you are proposing is there's a unique role of the state in actually help advancing some of what you lay out in your dual value framework. So share more about that. What is that uniqueness? What can they do? What should they do?
We were finding out that, right now, all credentials in community colleges are kind of treated the same when it comes to funding. And that really creates important bottlenecks. For example, in scaling credentials like nursing pathways, respiratory therapy, a lot of the technical allied health associate degrees that are in such high demand, especially in some regions like Central Valley, right? And it is really hard to scale these credentials without sustained specific support. So give you an example, hiring a program director or a faculty member in nursing is really challenging because the salaries of nurses, of an experienced nurse, is just so much higher than the
Sure.
salaries of a faculty member, but we are treating all faculty pay the same, right? And that is one example of if we are not providing sustained state support that could really supplement, augment salaries of faculty so that we can recruit enough faculty. You know, having a coordinator for clinical placements can really make a difference. These are all barriers that at the state level, they're much easier to address than a college trying to figure out how to scale a pathway on their own. And colleges are doing incredible work. Another example, and I think this one is really where states are uniquely positioned to intervene, is when we're talking about, again, CNAs or, you know, like low-wage hospital jobs or early childhood educators. These are places where, you know, in the next decade with an aging population, we're going to have so much need for example, direct support workers, direct care workers. And at the same time, these are really low-wage occupations. So if states don't intervene, a lot of colleges kind of have to make a choice between
Sure.
are we offering really high community value at the cost of individuals who most likely are women of color, right, in these low-wage hospital jobs, for example.
And who make up our communities.
And
right?
who make up our communities, right? And at the state level, though, we have different levers. These levers include, and these are some work that states are already doing, maybe not in a systematic way. You can have wage subsidies, you can have wage floors, you can have tuition assistance to make sure that you're helping individuals in low-wage hospital jobs actually get an associate degree in an allied health or nursing pathway. These are all things, and that is where you can really work on stackability at the state level. You can really fund it, you can really scale it, you can really support it. So I think the role of states, there's a lot of excitement for me personally in that they can really ensure that we get to both individual and community value, and that community value or economic development is not really happening at the cost of individuals, especially people of color, low-income students. Thank you.
So, as we always ask, as we ask our guests, where can they find the dual value framework?
If they go to edequitysolutions.com, it's, I think, on the front page, there is a link, so it should be easy to find.
Fantastic.
Thank you.